All right, hi guys. Obviously, I am not Venki, but I'm really excited that he asked me to give this lecture today on consciousness, which is perhaps like the most broad topic to give in one lecture. So there's a lot of ground to cover, and I'm not going to try to cover like all the theories of consciousness that are out there, but we'll try to make some headway. And definitely pop in with questions if you guys have any. I want this to be fun. All right, so today we're going to cover metacognition and consciousness. So first of all, what are these things? And then more importantly, how can we formalize the study of consciousness in neuroscience and computer science? And then lastly, sort of at the end, we'll discuss a little bit about this question. Is there something special about our subjective experience as humans? And so like I said, this is just to give you a taste of the tools that neuroscientists have used to answer these questions and what the progress in machine consciousness looks like. Right, so the objective here is to understand and critique current theories of consciousness and how it's studied in neuroscience. And then also hopefully you can explain the plausibility of machine consciousness to a friend later on when they ask you what you actually learned in this class. All right, so to begin, I'm going to show this clip from Westworld. So there are a lot of notions of consciousness out there, especially conscious AI, and a lot of these notions come from sci-fi films. So Westworld, if you guys don't know, is a show on HBO. And I'm not a big TV watcher, but like in preparation for this lecture, I actually watched a couple episodes. But if you haven't watched it, basically the premise is that there's this futuristic theme park called Westworld, where real humans go to interact with these like human-like AI robots, and they're called hosts. And these hosts are programmed to follow certain storylines, right? And so people go there to like entertain their fancy of like, you know, being like a cowboy and like killing other people and that kind of stuff. So in this clip, there's an interaction between Robert Ford, who's this old dude, and he's one of the founders of Westworld, and he's talking to this guy, Bernard, about the consciousness of these human-like hosts. So let's watch this clip.
I wonder, what do you really feel? After all, in this moment, you are in a unique position. A programmer who knows intimately how the machines work, and a machine who knows its own true nature.
I understand what I'm made of, how I'm coded, but I do not understand the things that I feel. Are they real? The things I experienced, my wife, the loss of my son.
Every host needs a backstory, Bernard, you know that. The self is a kind of fiction for hosts and humans alike. It's a story we tell ourselves, and every story needs a beginning. Your imagined suffering makes you lifelike.
Lifelike, but not alive. Pain only exists in the mind. It's always imagined. So what's the difference between my pain and yours? Between you and me?
This was the very question that consumed Arnold, filled him with guilt, eventually drove him mad. The answer always seemed obvious to me. There is no threshold that makes us greater than the sum of our parts, no inflection point at which we become fully alive. We can't define consciousness because consciousness does not exist. Humans fancy that there's something special about the way we perceive the world, and yet we live in loops as tight and as closed as the hosts do. Seldom questioning our choices, content for the most part to be told what to do next. Well, no, my friend, you're not missing anything at all.
All right. So some things that stood out to me, maybe stood out to you. What's the difference between my pain and yours? There is no threshold that makes us greater than the sum of our parts. And consciousness does not exist. So there are definitely notions here of what it means to be conscious, particularly in Westworld. They think that perhaps as long as you have enough of something that that you're no different than a human, right? So the hosts are maybe no different than a human. So let's just start off with a poll to get everyone's senses of this question. What is consciousness? So Paul, if you can. So what is consciousness? The ability to process information. Is it generalizable intelligent behavior? Is it the sum of a person's memories? Is it awareness of oneself at any moment in time? Or is it the qualia or the quality of sensory events such as color or touch? All right, interesting. We got a spread here. Let's see if we can get up to 90 something percent. Awesome, cool. Well, let's look at this. So most of you said it's the awareness of oneself at any moment in time. That's definitely like, part of our notion of why we think like we're conscious, but like, machines or cars, for example, aren't. But I would argue that all these other features are probably also part of consciousness, right? Like you can't really name it to one specific thing. Okay, so that's good. All right, let's go to the next slide. So I really like this quote from David Chalmers. He's a philosopher at NYU. And he says, there's nothing we know about more directly, but at the same time, it's the most mysterious phenomenon in the universe. So we all know what it means to be conscious because presumably we all are conscious, but it's very hard to describe, right? It's very hard to reduce down to just one thing or one description. And so there are also a lot of different notions of consciousness, right? Like if any of you have studied philosophy before, you probably have heard of the hard and the easy problems of consciousness. And so to break these down, the easy problems are those that are directly susceptible to scientific inquiry, right? So if I want to understand things in terms of computational or neural mechanisms, such as how the brain integrates information or categorizes stimuli or focuses its attention, like all these things can be studied with behavioral paradigms and recording neurons, and you can just have a simple description of how these processes work. So that's the easy problem. But the hard problem, or the problem of qualia, is the task of explaining why we feel a certain quality to our subjective experiences, right? And so these are the things that are a little bit harder to explain, like why, like how do you experience the redness of red, the quality of that redness, right? Or the feeling of being in love. Like emotion could just be a bunch of like neural, transmitters going off in your brain, but there's a quality to it, right? The feeling. So that's like the notion of consciousness in philosophy. Furthermore, in medicine, you might hear things said like the patient is no longer conscious or the patient is brain dead. And so these notions of consciousness are more akin to like wakefulness or vigilance, right? But I would say that, this presumes a level of like being on, right? So like if a machine isn't on, then it can't actually like do anything, right? So if a brain is not on, then, the person cannot do anything. And so we'll actually not focus on the philosophical or like the medical aspects of consciousness today, or the perspectives, but instead we want to make, our focus is to make the scientific study of consciousness tractable as it pertains to neuroscience and AI. All right, so how do we make the scientific study of consciousness tractable? So I'm going to go through some theories of consciousness in this next part. And I'll start with the earliest studies. So the earliest studies that had something to do with this notion of consciousness are these split brain patients, right? And I think we probably heard about these sometime early on in the class, but I'll just sort of briefly go over it. So the idea is that there are these experiments done on patients with severed corpus callosums, and this is usually done to treat epilepsy. And so the idea is like there's two hemispheres of the brain, right? But the surgery is done to split the fibers connecting the two hemispheres. And what's interesting about these patients is that they demonstrate strange behaviors. So there's this task that they expose these patients to where two words are flashed on a screen, one on the left visual field and one on the right visual field. And the subject's job is to report the word and then pick up the corresponding object with their left hand. Okay, so here we have to remember that things cross over in the brain, right? And also that for most people, if you're right-handed, the left brain is where your language and your speaking capabilities are, right? So interestingly, these people, because their brains are like split in half, essentially, the left brain only reports the word seen in the right visual field, right? So this patient will say out loud, ring, and they will deny seeing the left field stimuli. And remember, this is again because the visual field, after it enters the eyes, it crosses in the brain, right? And so the representations of the right visual field are in the left brain. So those are the only things that can be expressed. Whereas the left field, visual field, nothing there can be expressed. All right, but then you have to remember that motor control is also crossed in the brain, right? So the right brain, which controls the left hand, and that's the hand that has to go pick up the key, right? It sees the word key, and so the left hand goes to pick up the key. And so these are some of the first studies that sort of prompted this idea that there might be split consciousnesses between the right and the left brain, and that they're sort of like competing. And just a side note, this is what won Roger Sperry, who did these experiments, the Nobel Prize in 1981. And so I would say that this is where a lot of the first studies of consciousness came up, and they were entirely behavioral. But now moving on to some more modern theories. So there's this guy, his name is, I'm gonna butcher this, it's Stanislas Dehaene. He's a cognitive scientist at Collège de France, and he talks about how consciousness can be described as different levels of information processing. So this is now where the core of computational theories of consciousness come in. Okay, so he describes that there are 3 different levels of information processing. So the very first level is called C0, which is unconscious computations. And he argues this is where most of our intelligence lies. And also, like most machine computation right now in the present is in this category. The next level, which is a conscious level, is called C1, global availability. And he says this is the quality of being able to select information for global or whole brain broadcasting, making this information flexible for further computation, report, or action. And I'm going to go into these in detail. And the last one is called C2. And this is the quality of self-monitoring, or the awareness and monitoring of the computations being made. This is also called metacognition in psychology. And this leads to a subjective sense of certainty or error. And so his argument is that most machines lie in the category of C0, whereas conscious, like our consciousness, has aspects of both C1 and C2. All right, so first of all, C0. So we also have a lot of unconscious computations. And in fact, a lot of our information processing is unconscious. So imagine the following task to demonstrate this. So let's say you have a task where you're supposed to categorize the faces, like pictures of faces, into whether they're familiar faces or unfamiliar faces, right? And unbeknownst to you, the actual stimulus photo is going to appear before you see it. So what happens is, like, there's a mask. This is called a mask. It's just an image of like these scrambled faces that it doesn't really look like anything. And then in between this mask that's happening, there's like a really, really short, like 50 millisecond presentation of the actual stimulus that you might see, at least in this identical condition, okay? But the thing is, the presentation of this 50 millisecond, they call it a primer, is you can't actually perceive it. right? So you don't even notice that it happened. And so you can either do this with the identical stimulus photo. You can do this with a stimulus photo that is of the same person, but maybe in a different orientation. Or you can do it of a picture of like a totally unrelated person, okay? And so what you actually see again is you just see this mask of random stuff, and then you see the actual photo, and then you have to decide whether the photo is a familiar person or an unfamiliar person, okay? And so, Paul, if you want to throw up the second quiz. All right, so the idea is like, if you were asked to respond to these photos, a bunch of them, with these primed masks, what do you think your reaction time would be compared to the unprimed photos? Well, I guess the whole question didn't show up, but here's the whole question. Yeah, so the question is, your reaction time on the primed trials will increase compared to the unprimed trials, decrease compared to the unprimed trials, or be the same as the unprimed trials, right? So again, increase is like you're slower at responding to the image. Decrease means you're faster at responding to the image, and then, or it's just the same. Oh, so we got a little bit of a split opinion here. Let's see which one wins out. All right. Okay, so I misclicked. Sorry about that. Well, most of you, well, I guess not much more than chance, but more of you said that it should decrease compared to the unprimed trials. Yeah, maybe the wording was a little bit difficult, right? Because decrease reaction time is actually better. So yeah, let's look at the actual data. So this was an actual experiment done with these 3 different conditions. Like I said, either the mask was identical, related, or unrelated, right? And indeed, the reaction time on prime trials is much faster, right? So here, the purple reaction time bar is much significantly less than this unrelated primer. And another thing that is interesting is that actually in the brain, if you're doing this in an fMRI machine, and you look in the fusiform face area, which is the area responsible for looking at faces, you'll notice that there's actually reduced activity in that area for the identical condition compared to the related or the unrelated condition. And this is because of repetition suppression. So the idea is like the more that a subject sees the same stimulus again and again, the less the neural response every single time, right? And so even though these stimuli weren't perceptible to the person, the brain was actually processing it unconsciously. Do you have any questions about this? All right. And so, like I said, this is in the domain of what machines can currently do, right? And so machines are pretty good at visual invariance. They can categorize images of pictures from different, taken from different, vantage points. And machines are also generally really good at parallel computing, right? And so in the brain, for example, each part of the brain is processing information from different senses in different parts of the brain, right? But you're not conscious of all these different, processing computations. And similarly, like robots, they have different sensors, right? And these different streams of information come in through different sensors, but they're not necessarily being integrated or are interacting with each other. So that's C0, unconscious computation. Now, the next signature of consciousness is global availability. And so signature of C1 consciousness is that information is actually integrated across parallel and unconscious computational streams via what they call a global workspace that holds the temporary dominance of a thought. So this idea is that, you have sensory data coming in and it's put into this global workspace. And from this global workspace, there's a single thought or a single goal or a single thing that's going to drive your behavior, right? So for example, like if you're hungry and then all that thought begins to dominate you, like all I can think about is like, I want something to eat, then all your behaviors from then on are going to be in like foraging, essentially, like going to find food, like where can I go buy food? And so that's the crux of this idea. And just to note, this is also a serial information processing bottleneck. And so the idea is that even though there's all this processing that's being done in our brain, the real useful information is what becomes conscious, right? So there's only one percept in conscious thought at a time. And so, by breaking the modularity of the brain, these parallel streams of information are integrated into one stable thought to guide behavior. So one example is if you're driving and you see that the gas tank is low and the light is on, right? You're like, oh shoot, like I gotta go find gas, right? So this dominates our current thoughts and we have to navigate to the next gas station ASAP, right? So how do you do that these days? What if you're like somewhere that you don't know and you want to find a gas station? What do you do next? Anyone? Google Maps, exactly. And drive more slowly to be efficient. Right. So, well, this is what I would do. I would go to my handy dandy piece of AI that I literally like am stuck to every single day. And I would search up where's the nearest gas station, right? And then it will tell me where are all the gas stations along the route that I'm driving. And even tell me which one's the cheapest, right? And so this is the power of technology these days. So we're aware of this, we're being driven by this one thought. Whereas if you think about a car, okay, the car that you're in, it's not aware that its low fuel light is on. Like the low fuel light might be on, but the rest of the car is not like, oh my gosh, I need to go find a gas station right now, right? I mean, you could imagine a car perhaps in the future that was aware of this and then it by itself drove to a gas station. Like that would be quite amazing. But yeah, here the idea is just that that's not a capability that machines currently have. Okay, so as pertaining to the C1 consciousness, here's another quiz. What do you guys think happens to neural activity as stimuli come into conscious awareness, right? So do you guys think that neural activity scales with the presentation time? So like the longer the stimuli are presented, the more neural activity there will be? Or do you think it's all or none, right? Meaning that as soon as something comes into conscious awareness, stimuli will start to respond, or sorry, the neural response will start to be active. Oh, it's kind of split here too. Maybe it's good I'm not writing you guys' exam questions. All right, I think I'm gonna end the poll. Wow, it's literally 50-50, okay. All right. I mean, these are both plausible answers actually. And I don't know too much about the work in this space, but I don't doubt that both might be true in different brain areas. But at least in this one particular study that was done, neural activity was all or none. So let me go through this real quick. So here, Yes, Charles, that's the repeated presentation of a stimulus, not necessarily like the first detection. So here what happened is that there was a photo of the World Trade Center, okay? And this photo was presented for different durations. So either 33 milliseconds, 66 milliseconds, 132, 264. And then again, there was one of these scrambled mask images, right? That's presented for much longer after the fact. And so like in the previous example we talked about, we saw that when a photo is presented for a very short amount of time, you can't necessarily perceive it, right? But then people were asked to, well, at least in this case, monkeys were asked to indicate when they perceived like the actual stimulus. And you can see that there are these neurons in the prefrontal cortex that are selective to the photo of the World Trade Center. And as you can see, these histograms are basically sums of these spikes that happened, these blue spikes in response to the image. And you can see that overall, these neurons, they fire similarly after, from 66 milliseconds up, right? And then if you sort the trials by the trials in which the image was detected, or for the that's called recognized, versus the images that were not detected, you can see that there is a much larger firing rate for these recognized neurons. And so the idea is that brain activity, or the brain neurons, are more active if the stimuli is in conscious awareness and available for report. And even for stimuli of the same duration, so let's say like on one trial, I presented this 66 millisecond picture and you didn't see it, but then the next trial, the same duration, I presented it and you saw it, neural activity is higher and more stable for the trials in which you actually saw the image, you perceived the image, right? And so this tells us something about how neural activity is going to be all or none for a conscious percept. All right, so moving on to C2. So the signature of C2 consciousness is the ability to estimate one's own confidence in decisions, also known as metacognition. So this is the quality of like knowing that you know something, right? So whenever you say like, oh, I think I know the answer to that, or, I think I remember that, like you have a sense of your own cognitive abilities, right? And some more simple examples of this. So humans are fairly good at error detection. So for example, if you're typing really fast and you mistyped a word, like you pretty quickly know that you made an error, right? And we're also fairly good at confidence judgments. So like whether we're correct or not on a certain, problem, or like maybe when you're taking a test, you're like, wow, I really did bad on that test. Although sometimes like that can be faulty as well. Like you might think you did really bad, but you actually did really good, or vice versa. Humans are good at metacognition of their own abilities too, right? And so, you might know for sure that you're not strong enough to bench press 200 pounds, right? Or at least I'm not strong enough to bench press 200 pounds. Maybe you are. But a robot, for example, who, was just built to do some kind of mechanical function might not know that. And so it would just break upon trying to attempt a task that it wasn't physically capable of. Unless it was like pre-programmed to know, but it's hard to guess the weight of something before you've tried it out. So because of this, machines generally lack meta knowledge of the reliability and limits of what they've actually learned. And so one example here of C2 consciousness in babies, in infants, is that in these 1.5-year-old infants, they basically, expose them to this task where they're presented with these two boxes, and they're shown that a toy is in one of these boxes, okay? And then they like wait for 3 to 12 seconds, okay? And these are really, really young babies, so it's not like it would be obvious that they could just remember where, the toy was. But then after this delay, they are asked to remember where the toy was and then point to which box it was in. And so there are two signatures that babies are able to self-monitor their abilities. So the first one is that they actually persist in searching for the hidden object when their initial choice was correct than when it was incorrect. So they kind of know that they were right. And they're like, I'm going to put my hand in there and try to like find where it is. And like, I'm going to keep looking if I don't touch it yet, because I know it's in there, right? And then another thing is when given an opportunity to actually ask for help, they use this option to avoid making errors, right? So they have a sense that if they're not confident in their decisions, they can actually get outside, help and confirmation. So that's just one experiment that shows C2 consciousness. And in the review paper that I actually posted, there are so many other different experiments showing these 3 levels of consciousness. It's a very, very nice paper. So, at some point, if you have time, it'd be nice to go through if you're interested. Also, this could be a great, thing to write about for your final paper. So that's also an idea. Okay, so that is one general, computational theory of consciousness. There's another one that's pretty prominent called integrated information theory. And this was put forth by a guy named Giulio Tononi at the University of Wisconsin. And the idea of IIT is that the simultaneous processing and distribution / integration of information is a measure of consciousness. So how interconnected nodes or neurons are, this can actually be measured, they argue, and it's measured in a single value called phi. And because I'm nerdy, I actually have phi earrings that I wore today for the occasion. So, yeah. But anyways, to just give you an example of what phi means. So if you think about like a digital camera, right? It has millions of light receptors, but these light receptors don't communicate with each other necessarily, like they don't work together. And so therefore phi is small. Now, if you contrast this with the human brain is very well connected, and neural impulses constantly travel from one part to another, right? It's always talking to each other. And so therefore phi is really large, or as they would argue. Now, I know that was a very short presentation of this, but what are some potential problems with IIT that you can think of, right? So Paul, you can put up the quiz. Okay, computing phi is time consuming. No systematic way to divide up the parts of the system. Hard to relate to an empirical measure of consciousness. Oop, one of these was not relevant. And then all of the above.
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened with the last one.
It's okay. All right. So it seems like there is a bit of a more consensus on this. Most people said all of the above. Yes, very good. So, when you have a measure, like one single value measure of consciousness, like, you should be skeptical, right? So it is true, first of all, computing phi is very time consuming. I don't know how this was calculated, but apparently even for the smallest nervous system in the C. elegans, like about 300 neurons, they said that it would take, or I read this somewhere, it would take like millions of years to compute phi or something like that. I don't really know how like valid that is, but even if that were true, even if computing phi was easy, for example, like to me, there's no real way to really divide up the parts of a system in a systematic way, right? So how would you decide that, these groups or clusters of neurons constitutes a module, or do you treat them all as distinct nodes, modules? And then finally, it's hard to relate to an empirical measure of consciousness, right? Because we don't really have one single empirical measure. And what's actually really funny is that apparently they've calculated phi for like a bunch of different things. I don't know, like it's probably an approximation. But they said that they found that phi, for someone in a coma or an unconscious state is actually really high, that's not consistent with our understanding of consciousness. And for like some AI systems, they calculated that phi was like comparable to a human being, which is also doesn't really make sense, right? So I think that these theories are still being refined. Again, the field is like so big, but what's actually you might find interesting to know is that in October 2019, the Templeton World Charity Foundation, they started this formal competition between these two theories of consciousness. Okay, so specifically this global workspace theory and then this integrated information theory. And they're funneling like tons of money into this to do experiments on humans. Total costs of 20 million, more than 500 participants doing these fMRI and EEG tasks. And just to hash this out, like, which theory is more correct? And I heard that they modeled this after back in the day in 1919, Albert Einstein going against Isaac Newton's theories of gravity. And so, it's arguable, is consciousness as tractable as something like gravity? I'm not sure. But the basic summary of this, debate is that, they both say that there's different parts of the brain that could be responsible for consciousness. So in global workspace theory, they say it's the prefrontal cortex. In IIT, they say it's the back of the brain. I don't know too much about this literature, but you can look more into it. You can write a review paper about it. And then the differences in what they think where consciousness arises from is that in workspace theory, they say that it arises from the selection of prioritized information from this global workspace to be broadcasted out, right, to influence action. Whereas in IIT, like we said, it's about the interconnectedness of brain networks, right? The more neurons that interact with one another, the more one would feel conscious, even without explicit sensory input. So take from that what you will. But now, having gone over, the different possible theories of consciousness, now we want to ask, like, is it plausible for machines to be conscious, right? So given these definitions, particularly the C1, C2, like, can machines have these kinds of consciousness? So if you just take these definitions as they are, so C1 being global availability, there are some signatures of this in certain AI architectures. So in the 1960s, there was actually this computational architecture called a blackboard system, where the idea is that you have these different modules responsible for different subtasks or sub goals, right? And then there would be like this overall module that's like managing the goals, and everything would be like processed here on this blackboard, or being sent to the specialized modules that would perform these individual tasks and then be combined all together again. So this has a flavor of like global workspace. And then more recently, DeepMind had this algorithm called PathNet. And some of you computer science people might know more about this than I do, but essentially it's a genetic algorithm which learns paths through its many specialized neural networks and figures out which path is most suited to a given task, right? And so again, it's like there are different modules of things that are specialized for different tasks and can be used in this flexible combinatorial manner. So those are some hints of C1 consciousness, maybe. As for C2, self-monitoring, this is still a stretch for most AI. So it's hard for AI to understand its own knowledge limitations. There is one kind of network architecture called Bayesian networks, and they compute with probability distributions, right? So because you compute with the probability distributions, you can keep track of how likely you are to be correct, or at least how uncertain you are about your estimate or something like that. So that's sort of akin to knowing your own uncertainty, right? And then one of these other network architectures, which has been pretty popular recently, are called generative adversarial networks, or GANs. And so the architecture here is that there's a primary network and a secondary network. So the primary network is called the generative network, which is here on the bottom. And the generator basically produces samples of stimuli, let's say images, for example. Whereas there's a second network called the adversarial network that basically has real images. And then these are both fed into a discriminator, which says like, okay, does this generated image look similar enough to the real image? And if the discriminator can be fooled, then that means your generator is like pretty good at generating images, right? And so this discriminator evaluates like the authenticity of these self-generated representations. So one silly example I pulled from Google directly is like at the beginning of learning, for example, the generator may come up with this, you know, dollar bill or $10 bill image, whereas the real thing is over here, and the discriminator obviously says, oh, of course that's fake and this one's real, right? But then after time, after learning, the discriminator is now fooled, because now the generator is able to generate images that look exactly like the real thing. And so perhaps this is an architecture that can also have a sense of self-monitoring, or like knowing how well it's doing. But again, it requires like a whole different network in order to sort of judge the other network. All right, so that's sort of like the plausibility of machine consciousness. But of course, there are some objections, right, to this computational definition of consciousness. So these are purely information processing theories. And again, we're not addressing this idea, this subjective experience, right, this hard problem of consciousness. And so one question to ask is like, does our experience, like this subjective stuff, escape a computational definition or rigorous study? And I think that these are some of my favorite examples, and I would call them rebuttals, right? And so here, Deheane is arguing that the loss of these C1 and C2 computations, it co-varies with the loss of subjective experience, right? So he's saying there's probably actually some ground to this just being information processing. So from neuroscience, one of these examples is blind sight. Okay, so in blind sight, patients have damage to their primary visual cortex, and they can't see anything in the affected visual field. So here in this picture, you can see there's a lesion in V1. And if this is somebody's entire visual field, all this blacked out area is like, are their blind spots. They can't report seeing anything there. But what's interesting here is you can do experiments on these people, right? And you can flash lights in their blind spots and then ask them to report whether they saw something or not, right? And obviously they're going to say like, oh, we can't see anything, so why would we try to report? But then the experimenter would say like, oh, just guess. Okay, if you don't know, just guess. And what's amazing is that if you look at these black squares with these numbers on them, these are actually the percentage of trials they got right, like total. And so even though they report not being able to see anything, they have lost their C1 consciousness. And they also can't assess whether they were correct or not. So they honestly just think that they're guessing, but they guess like very much above chance. That's also a loss of self-monitoring, right? That correlates with the loss of subjective experience, right? And so here's one example where these two computational processes definitely relate to subjective experience. And one more example here. This is one of my favorite experiments in all of experimental psychology, is visual neglect. Okay, so damage to the posterior parietal cortex, which is up here, it leads to a neurological condition called visual neglect. And these people have normal vision, but super strange, they ignore one side of an entire object. Okay, so there are these famous experiments done where a participant with visual neglect will see these two houses, okay? And then the experimenter will ask them, are there any differences between these two houses? And the patient will say no. And then the experimenter will ask, which house would you prefer to live in? And almost every single time the patient will say the bottom one, or like, you know, whichever one is not on fire, right? And so there's this idea that like, even though they report not being able to see the differences between these two pictures, they're somehow aware that like one of them is a burning house and the other one's not, right? But in fact, they can't see like the whole left side, or they can't consciously report seeing the whole left side of these houses. So I find this super fascinating. And again, this is a loss of these C1 and C2 computations, right? So they can't report the differences, and they're not aware of whether they're correct or not. And so with these kinds of, you know, behavioral studies, Deheane argues that subjective experience appears to cohere with possession of C1 and C2. And so, you know, he says something provocative, which is that although centuries of philosophical dualism have led us to consider consciousness as unreducible to physical interactions, the empirical evidence is compatible with the possibility that consciousness arises from nothing more than specific computations. And so, you know, going back to what we saw in the beginning, like maybe Ford was correct in that there is no threshold that makes us greater than the sum of our parts, no inflection point at which we become fully alive. So that's kind of provocative. And I guess I'll end with this before we go out into breakout rooms. And so there's this larger question here of, you know, what does it mean to be human, right? And can we even conceive of conscious beings that are not human, right? I think animal consciousness is another one of those fields of like debate. And, you know, like, I think there's this interesting aspect of machine intelligence where, like, at least in sci-fi, it seems like we're trying to make machines like us, right? Like if they can be somehow, you know, as conscious as us, as able to generalize as us, that we're making them in our own image, right? And so there's a lot of like philosophical and like religious sort of undertones to this. And there have been books written about this. There have been articles written about this. And so that's a whole nother field of research that if you're interested in, you can go look at. But okay, so I guess that is all I had to say there. But I thought that we could spend maybe a little bit longer in breakout rooms today, maybe until like 5:38. I don't know, 5. Yeah, I'll prompt you guys. But the question that I would like you guys to discuss, and there are a lot of subpoints, right? Is that, you know, would you call a machine that fulfills these two criteria, C1, C2, you know, consciousness, would you call them conscious or still just, you know, intelligent, right? And is our idea of consciousness inherently linked to the experience of being human or unique? And so some thoughts this might elicit is, you know, whether consciousness is different and distinct from intelligence. Is it just another form of like super intelligence? Should we even care? Like, does consciousness even matter for AI? Or is this subject matter to be contained in movies? And if you guys want to go there, what are the philosophical or religious implications of conscious AI? I see the chat. All right, so let me first paste this into the chat so you guys have these questions. And sorry about that. That was my Slack. I should have turned it off.
And
Okay.
I'll send people in the rooms.
Yeah, hold on. Let me paste this first. Okay, there we go. And you can send me into one too.
Yeah.
All right. So, would you call those machines conscious? Are they just intelligent? What is the relationship between the two? Someone start me off from one of the rooms.
So we were in the group with, thank you, Anthony, for volunteering me. We were in the room with Paul, but we were back and forth with this. Like initially we had said that, and I think we concluded with the fact that we don't think that these machines are conscious, even though they are intelligent, but it did open up dialogue for us to see like we're more similar than we think. Like for example, someone brought up GPT-3 and how like it's able to pretty much like almost hold conversations or like write poems. And another person said, well, all that's going on there is they're being given Wikipedia and they're just generating new like strings, new phrases from there. But someone else said, well, how's that different from what we do? We read books and then from there we're generating new sentences. And I thought that was really interesting. But I guess another point that was brought up was that we want to kind of get a better idea of the discussion. We thought, well, would we consider animals conscious? And we concluded yes, mostly because from our experience, animals know their limits. And I guess in some cases, like some animals like can recognize themselves in reflection, like
It's
in
a
the
good
water
point.
or in the mirror.
The mirror test. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, all very good points. I love that. All right, give me a controversial view, someone.
Potentially.
Rumi. Oh, Christopher, go ahead.
I can go after.
All right, Rumi, let's hear your controversialness.
I just report the discussion in our section, in our little group. So we were discussing on like the nature of like the like actual like individual soul or value to an AI, and like an AI, theoretical like sentient AI, and what would separate them from a person. And essentially if consciousness is entirely physical, then there's nothing particularly special about you or me. But on the other hand, if people have souls, then there is a kind of line that you need to draw, which then transforms the question into a very religious kind of spiritual question. And like there's also like kind of a discussion of like how seriously do we take like consciousness and intelligence, because it seems to me that like it clearly requires like a bit of intelligence to be conscious. Like the example about being meta aware of your own abilities, it requires creativity, foresight, and like some kind of awareness. So it's clear that like consciousness and intelligence are connected, but like it's unclear how seriously we should take consciousness as an idea, like if it is the case that the body and the mind are really the same. So yeah, those were a small tidbit of what was discussed.
And before I let Christopher talk, I'll just bring up one objection, which is that what about someone who has limited intelligence, right? Like either has Down syndrome or some other kind of, you know, born with some kind of condition. Like they're still conscious, conscious, but perhaps not intelligent. Also, do you guys, it's like raining in Cambridge like so hard right now. Like what the heck? But anyway, Christopher, you can go.
Okay, yeah, there are two kind of controversial points to like. So one, I guess, relating to what you were just talking about. So the question of like whether consciousness is like a thing or whether first-person experience is a thing that we can separate from intelligence is like very interesting, but also something that like even Descartes was kind of answering with like cogito ergo sum. Like you can't really deny that you have first-person experience. So you can kind of generalize from that. Like first-person experience is a thing, it's possible, and to some degree it's separable from like any question of like capabilities or intelligence or like anything objective with information processing. Though there's certainly a connection, if only because like the fact that we can talk about our first person experiences, even if we can't communicate them, means there must be some like physical connection between like wherever that first person experience resides and the like neurons, muscles, et cetera, that are allowing us to speak about it. But that it ends up like raising a bunch of ethical questions though about like, if you could create a machine that had like first person experience, then there, and we were talking at the very end of our group about like, what is it ethical to do to that? And there's thought experiments about like, if you were to say create a machine that has first person experience but no memory, then maybe is it ethical to do like whatever terrible thing you want to it? Which I mean really ends up being the same question as like, you imagine like a surgeon or someone about to undergo surgery who is given an anesthetic that doesn't do anything about the pain, but shuts off the like part of like hippocampal memory storage. So they don't remember the pain afterwards. And like, maybe like after the procedure, that it's the same effect, they have no memory of the pain. Is that ethical? Unclear.
Yeah.
You end up with like, in the one case you would think probably not, but like, if the effect is the same, then maybe.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, in Westworld, this is what they do. They erase the memory of the hosts, you know, after every story. Jay?
This is sort of related to that, but many times when people undergo trauma, they can unintentionally suppress the memory. So that is something that does actually happen, although it is not usually intended by the person causing the harm.
Definitely. Jacob is bringing up the question of how do we know that each of us, all 33 of us on the Zoom call, are actually conscious? Can we extrapolate from our own experience? Thank you, Jacob. All right, well, we're just about out of time. Thank you guys. This was a really fun discussion and hope you guys have some more discussion in your sections. But yeah, I'll stay around for a couple more questions. We can pause the record or stop the recording.